Welcome to Film Explorer podcast series extended. My name is Giuseppe Di Salvatore, editor of Film Explorer, and today we are at Locarno Film Festival to discuss about film and artificial intelligence with Evelyn Kreutzer. Evelyn, welcome.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, Evelyn, you are a film scholar and video essayist, and currently work in the research team of Kevin Billy at the University of Lugano. And Kevin Billing and his team are not only working on videography, but also contributes every year at the Locarno Film Festival with inputs and reflection about the future of cinema. Film Explorer interviewed already last year Kevin here, but this year the proposal with conference, workshop, and several public meetings turned around the theme, the future of survival, which is developed on three axes of reflection. So one is technological, another is sociological, and the third one is environmental. And today with Evelyn, we are focusing on the technological axis, making echo to a roundtable on artificial intelligence and film, which took place in Locarno the 14th of August. But before speaking about the inputs at the roundtable, Evelyn, I would like to ask you a general question. I mean, we are speaking about technology and cinema, and we can say that concerning the survival theme, the technology is useful for cinema to survive, or actually, we can also reverse and imagine cinema as something that survives technology. So this is typical of being enthusiast or having fear of technology. So between these two positions, where do you see yourself?
Well, I like to call myself a cinematic media romantic, perhaps. I mean, people have been talking about the impending death of cinema for decades, or basically from the beginning of cinema, and certainly from the beginning of sound film. And then certainly in the last couple of decades with digital cinema, and now AI is this whole new thing. I've always been convinced that cinema will never die, and cinema and theaters won't ever die either. In fact, I've certainly sensed for myself, for the people around me, and just anecdotally from observation, that the more oversaturated we seem to become with our media exposure and media environments, the more we feel a need and a desire for concentrated media enjoyment. And I think that actually pulls people into cinemas more, into festivals as well, including the festival we just attended, and also within film studies, more and more into in-person conferences, certainly post-COVID, because there seems to be this increased desire to almost to go back to in-person encounters, one-on-one encounters, and including one-on-one encounters with a given film or a given media experience, because when we're at home, we second screen the whole experience. We feel very distracted. I like to think of this image that we all are familiar with of our laptops with 1,000 tabs open. Sometimes I feel like that's our experience of life in this day and age, and that heightens this desire to go back to a single concentrated dark theater experience. So from that very general basis, I have no real anxieties or fears about the death of cinema or the death of creativity. But I certainly believe that what we call cinema now might look very different in the future. And actually, one of the attendees of our conference, Laura Huertas-Millán, raised this kind of provocative and interesting point that cinema precedes us and cinema will outlive us. If we think of cinema as something much larger than this movie theater experience or the dispositif that we usually associate with it, if we think of cinematic experience, the world as and through cinema, that will outlive us all. I'm not sure I want to completely agree with that, but it's certainly a provocative and evocative statement.
Yeah, anyway, I mean, media, as you told, and technology in general is a challenge for cinema, but in a positive way, if I understand well what you are saying, in the sense that it pushes us to reframe all the time the condition of cinema experience or film experience. And in this framework, of course, we can even rediscover the specificity of cinema theater experience or the specificity of old cinema. But more specifically now, one of the invited guests of this roundtable around artificial intelligence and film was Trillo. And he embodied something like a real enthusiasm of the new technology and what we can achieve and the experience that we can do in the creative work, but also as a viewer in film. How did you cast him, or did you cast him exactly because of this enthusiasm? Because of course, we know very, very well that concerning artificial intelligence, there is a lot of fear, also a lot of concern. So how was the casting process?
Well, we didn't line him up among a lot of other people and try to cast him. No, well, the reason why we thought of Paul Trillo was that he's been one of the most prolific figures in this very new form of generative AI video, who has been not just embracing these new tools, but has really positioned himself as someone who wants to create a new AI-specific cinematic language and use these tools not just to, that's his position at least, to not just mimic cinema, audiovisual media that have existed before AI, but see how AI can create something different, something new, which in and of itself I find very intriguing. But then he's the first, or one of the first filmmakers to use Sora, this very new generative video technology that isn't even out there yet for all of us to try out, but he's had first dibs on the form, and he's been making short films and videos in which he tries to do that. Let's see how text to video generative AI can create a different language. Whether you like the videos or not, I think it's hard to disagree with, or it's clear to see what he is trying to do there. There's a language of the cinematography he uses there that does look different from the otherwise more perhaps conventional hyper-realist takes on AI imagery. We were really intrigued by that. We wanted to talk to him about it. But the funny thing is that people seem to take him as this almost this one-sided AI enthusiast. And I don't really think he is that. I think he has a lot of critical thoughts on AI too. I talked to him after his presentation in the roundtable, and he said, yeah, it's funny, you know that I'm not an evangelical of new AI technology, right? But I think this is what happens when, I mean, certainly AI evokes a lot of conversation, triggers a lot of anxieties in people. And when you have someone who at least openly embraces AI for his creative work, it's easy to put him in that specific corner. But I think his creative impulse to use these tools in some ways, perhaps even against the initial purpose of why AI technologies for video came into being, that alone puts him in a slightly more ambivalent position than he might be taken as sometimes.
Yeah, what struck me is actually that he spoke a lot about this technology as the occasion to accept failure, for example. What he's interested in is really breaking the tools and actually using technology in order to reveal it instead of trying to be realist. But I'm just wondering whether this approach, this focus on the media itself, to work with the media in order to also show the media as a medium, is it not probably a symptom of the fact that we are still at the beginning of using this medium? Because the fact that we concentrate on the medium itself, what is possible to do, and even the limits, of course, and showing the limits of the medium, it's something probably, yeah, that's typical of a moment when the medium is still not really appropriated. I don't know if it will be time now just to use the tools without actually focusing on the medium as a medium. What do you think?
I totally agree. And as a media historian, I can't help but constantly feel like I'm seeing in this discourse on AI, I'm seeing echoes from all the major technological innovations in history. Like, I mean, there are certain anxieties and hopes that get evoked in reaction to, if you trace back media technologies of the 20th and even 19th century, there are these anxieties and hopes that always reoccur. And it's usually this idea of democratization on the one hand, democratization of access to knowledge, in this case now access to creativity, etc., access to images, And on the other hand, the numbing of the masses, mass control, in this case, mass like big data, the anxieties around data. I do think that in this moment around AI, the anxieties around jobs being destroyed by AI is particularly strong, and maybe stronger than in some other historical moments in the past. But still, I would wrap this up in really, you can put it in a lineage of anxiety, if so to speak. And yet I also just see this as this is a new cinema of attractions moment. And I think it's interesting, and I think you pointed to this as well, that in the presentation and the Q&A with Paul Trillo, we looped some of his videos in the background, muted, and very few people really mentioned or addressed the specific videos that we saw. The conversation was much more general about AI, about the affordances of AI and the shortcomings and the dangers of AI. But there wasn't a lot of talk about the specific style, the specific images that we saw in the background. And in some ways, I think that's emblematic of this moment that we're in, where the existence, the conceptualization of this technology is so new and crass and hard to grasp that really dominates the conversation. And perhaps this is especially true in, scholarly circles like ours, where all of these like media nerds like myself talk about the philosophy behind AI or what this means to film theory, etc. Whereas arguably filmmakers like Paul Trillo, but also like others, they just go ahead and use it. And I think, if I understand Paul correctly, this is his position, like the genie is out. I mean, like this, there's no going back. Better use it and like figure out how to use it now. And certainly, I mean, with all this hesitancy around certainly leftist critics and filmmakers around AI, you can certainly make an argument, as sympathetic as I am to that criticism, you can certainly make an argument that if we don't use these technologies, we're immediately giving away any kind of control and just let big tech take it and determine where it will go. So I'm appreciative of filmmakers and artists who, despite all the skepticism, take that on and see what we can do with it as well.
Yeah, I also agree with this point, with this political concern, I would say, concerning technology. And in the roundtable, for example, Richard Misek was quite vocal about the criticism of the argument of democratization of AI as a technology that gives possibility to many people to be creative. That's an old argument I also agree with completely. But more the question that I found more difficult probably is the ecological question of power consumption. At the same time, I was also speaking with him because he's working really on the studies about trying to measure this consumption and the ecological impact of artificial intelligence. At the same time, it's quite impossible or very difficult to do, for example, comparative studies in order to say, okay, is there a film that is now generated with artificial intelligence? The consumption is taught, but how much will be the consumption of energy of classical cinema? Just thinking of Hollywood, of course, the comparison will be quite difficult to do.
It's really hard to determine. And I think this speaks to a lot of very uncomfortable paradoxes that to me have come out of these couple of days that we spent talking about these topics, which is, on the one hand, I think it's very important to raise these points that Richard did, like because we sometimes have this naive idea that by creating stuff in our laptops that before required a lot of transportation, logistics, etc., that's just neutral, ecologically neutral, which of course it's not. At the same time, though, involving more human labor also that comes with ecological costs, right? And we can't negate that. And similarly, there was a lot of talk about, within the larger scope of ecological concerns and festivals, film festivals' roles, is the future of festivals on a more local level to avoid all the fossil fuels involved in transportation, people flying all over the world to attend festivals, etc. Could that be the future, that we have these local hubs and we limit those costs in that way? At the same time, though, this really goes against the also very important desire to have more diverse attendees for festivals. And the same goes for academic conferences, right? So that's a paradox that's really hard to solve. On the one hand, you want to bring in especially more participants from the global south to these festivals like Locarno that are situated in relatively exclusive places in Europe or in the US. At the same time, though, that also means these will have a bigger ecological impact. How do you consolidate those paradoxes? I think that's true in many ways of AI too, because you could say, well, yeah, because of AI now, perhaps way more footage will be created than before. So we don't even need to think of this invisible sibling analog or non-AI sibling that would be produced otherwise, because now we will have films and videos that would have never seen the light of day. And so that's an extra impact, ecological impact. At the same time, though, from this more positivistic, democratizing point of view, you could say, yeah, but it's great that now people get to make films who would otherwise never have been able to make those films because they had no budgets, no access to tech and facilities, cameras, etc. So yeah, how do you consolidate those two? It's certainly something that troubles me quite a lot.
And I think it's also a question of perspective, because there's a lot of focus among the media nerds, as you say, about the infrastructure and the structural question concerning technology, concerning cinema. At the same time, there is the question, what does it mean to have the technology? And how do we use something like artificial intelligence? How cooperative, how much sharing, for example, the question of open source. And yeah, from this point of view, I think it could be interesting to come back what we were saying, independently of the analysis of the structural and material condition of artificial intelligence. What are the results, and to focus also on these, to discuss about these. There was probably something a bit missing in the roundtable, and something that I'd like now probably to expand with you, because one thing that I really observed is that the film that was screened by Paul Trillo were screen muted. We are speaking a lot about the visual aspect of the artificial intelligence generation, but there was no question about sound. And of course, there is a sound generation also with artificial intelligence, but it was just the occasion for me to reflect. I don't know, is it that now the concentration on artificial intelligence make us focus in a separate way the question of sound, the question of image? Are we back to this compartmentation of cinematic aspect that actually should be essentially thought together? So is, according to you, artificial intelligence pushing us to think image and sounds in a separate way?
I think that's a really interesting question. And also for me as a sound scholar, I think it does push us to separate those layers at the moment, but I'm sure it won't take long for those to kind of be joined a bit more. I think it's because generative AI has developed somewhat separately. I don't think I've heard really all that much about generative AI sounds. It's mostly music. That's actually earlier moment in our AI anxieties than images even. It was this, all of this, oh my God, AI can compose like Beethoven. This almost seems like an outdated shock moment to me now. And then we came to images. And I mean, generative AI video is really in its absolute infancy. And Sora only, as of now, creates, very short clips. And again, Sora is not even available for general use yet. But I think in video now, there's what I'm seeing also in line with this idea of like AI cinema of attractions. I'm seeing a heightened interest and fascination with motion. On the one hand, I think that's what AI videos struggle with most, because they are based on still images. This is where AI footage can look most clunky. I guess like movement is harder to reproduce in some ways, which again, I find really interesting, because that also takes me back to super, super early cinema, where movement also looked weird because analog film was based on still images. And it took us a while to figure out how many frames per second looked most natural, right? Like early cinema, people walking in very, very early films, it looks odd. It looks a little clunky. It looks a little bit artificial. And I think that's what we're seeing now. And that also creates a heightened interest in creating motion and movement that does not look like that. And I would say that Paul Trillo's work certainly really exceeds in this, in creating a movement focused cinematic language that doesn't look hyper realistic, quote unquote, because that's not what he's trying to do, but it creates its own flow of movement. But perhaps, as some critics would probably argue, he overdoes it with movement and motion as well. And actually, I found quite funny that a lot of comments on one of his latest YouTube videos was all about motion sickness and how this film made them sick, which again, this is something that people said about early cinema. It's a really bizarre and fascinating renaissance of those curiosities and those anxieties. And in some ways, then it's also fitting that we might think of this moment in generative AI video as a recurrence of silent cinema and don't really take sound into the equation very much. And I actually don't know how the sound was created for Sora videos. I don't really know what role sound plays in Sora videos. It doesn't seem to play a big role in their promotional videos. Those are all focused on the hyperrealism of the images. So I do think we have at this early stage 2 separate sound image universes, but I have no doubt that just like with sound cinema, we'll get there quite quickly.
You made a lot of references now to the cinema attraction, the early years of cinema. And actually, there was another topic in the roundtable that was quite interesting for me, and that was a reference to the past within the technology of artificial intelligence. Because actually, of course, artificial intelligence use images that already exist. So it's sort of continuously recycling it, of course, creating with these new images, but still pushing us back probably to old images. And mostly Miriam De Rosa in the roundtable stressed this point and stressed a sort of archaeological fashion in artificial intelligence as a sort of motivator. Nostalgia probably is an intrinsic element of what we liked or what we could experience anyway in the artificial intelligence generated films. It's a huge theme, but it's something that really found interesting exactly now, how in a way something very new is bound to an experience of memory, of also misremembering. That was a theme that was discussed by Paul and Miriam in the roundtable. So how is your approach? Do you feel also this sort of vintage attraction in artificial intelligence?
I don't so much feel the vintage attraction to the output of these AI tools, but I find them most interesting in relation to what they reveal and what the data sets at the basis of them reveal about us. On a really reductive level, you could say it's not really artificial intelligence anyway. It's the result of collective data-fied intelligence. But intelligence is a questionable term in that regard too, because and this came up in the conversation, the data sets are a representation and a reproduction of our very flawed, also very hierarchical, exclusive, biased, collective assumptions and yeah, a reproduction of our misguided memories or flawed memories and flawed ideas. And I think there is a lot of danger that comes from that. And there's a reason why some artists who have played around with live AI performances have a hard time doing that in public, because you never know what images will be generated, right? There's a lot of discourse around that. And that I find most interesting, actually. At the same time, though, of course, and I'm not an expert in this at all, but in terms of how those databases are being regenerated, re-edited. But I think this curiosity in and of itself also speaks to this very early moment in this technology, because those databases are already in the process of feeding themselves, right? So like if we have this basic idea of our collective ideas, images, thoughts, as wrong, as flawed, as problematic as they might be, but they are the basis for what we're seeing with AI output now, that's already outdated or in the process of being outdated, because now those data sets regenerate themselves, feed themselves. And then, I mean, this is the perfect postmodern nightmare in a way, that artificial intelligence then feeds artificial intelligence. And we're already in that moment. And actually, I talked to Richard at another point during the conference, and he brought up that these big AI companies now also employ trained filmmakers to just walk around and capture shots, as many as they can of just whatever trees, people, I don't know, whatever they might need, because they're running out of images to build their technologies on. And so there's this really dark, cynical image of trained filmmakers walking around being paid really poorly to capture footage that will then replace their skills and their jobs. So I think like maybe there was a hot second for nostalgia, but I think we're already past that point. I'm not sure nostalgia is the right term anymore.
I mean, for you as a video essayist, you have also a special perspective about this question, because I mean, working with archive footage, with all the images anyway, with images that already exist, because in your practice, you have a very, very aware and conscious approach to existing images. And of course, what artificial intelligence does is also a bit the same. So it's sort of a super video essayist, but where the essayistic aspect is automatized. Of course, there are also ALIA algorithms that assure the novelty or the creativity in the artificial intelligence generation. But at the same time, you have not this critical or very conscious, reflective attitude towards old images and in general our archive footage and archive images. So now I'm curious, what will be the application of artificial intelligence in videography, in video essay? Is it sort of an oxymoron, is sort of absurd, actually conceptually absurd movement to do or gesture to do, or is something that you are curious to explore also as video essayist?
Yeah, first of all, I'll say I never thought of generative AI as a super video essay practice. That's really bleak to think about. But as you rightly pointed out, the main element that is missing is the essayistic, really, and it is the critical intervention. And in many ways, I mean, I think I actually feel reconfirmed in our practice and the need for a critical media analytical practice like what we do with video essays. I mean, I was always aware that other people and now other machines can edit better than me, can create more or not interesting, but more polished imagery than me. The thing that I bring to the table is my critical thinking. That I am convinced of still. That won't go away. People might call me naive, but I do think that can't be recreated endlessly, at least. But yes, I'm very curious about using AI tools. I haven't really done it much yet, but I have plans for 1 or 2 video essays that are sort of in the making, in the pre-production phase, that I will share in the near future. And there are people in our community who have already worked with AI quite extensively, including Dana McLeod, who's based in Canada, who does these really wonderful and very funny, but at the heart, very critical videos where she uses her own AI avatar and does this very performative take on AI recycling of knowledge and of images, etc., and of people, in this case, her own self. And Johannes Binotto has made some really interesting AI video essays where he uses generative AI images, not moving images, but images in a way uses these still images, AI still images, to deconstruct canonical moving images. So he made an AI video essay on Vertigo, Hitchcock's Vertigo, for example, where he literally instills these still images that he created based on Vertigo with AI software to really, I mean, this is like the ultimate uncanny, like production of the uncanny, turning these well-known images into sort of into a flow of monstrous deconstructions. So people are already using them, But here too, I think we're in our absolute infancy. We as media historians, media scholars tend to look back more so than look in the here and now. But I think this is also what's changing now, because we have to use and critique these tools while they're being developed.
Great. I think we expand already a lot about this topic, artificial intelligence and film, with a specific focus that was this year Locarno Film Festival with the future of survival. I don't know if you want to say something about your own perception of the idea of survival. Should we fear, or should we, or there is an urgency that you feel more specifically now concerning the relationship between cinema and technology?
Well, again, I'm a bit of a romantic, but also perhaps as an historian, I want to say we've survived everything until now, at least media technology wise, right? We have survived all these big crises and have adapted. I do want to believe in the adaptability of humans. I'm actually just really curious how creativity will change based on these developments. What kinds of creative output will we discover that only humans can generate in the future? And maybe that's the thing that we will want more so than anything else. But I also realize that, yes, we may have survived until now, but at what cost, right? I mean, there was a lot of casualties on the way. Still, as I said before, I think cinema will survive, and I think academia will survive too, because I guess like one of the anxieties that came out of these conversations was also academic survival or critical survival. But we will have to adapt, and that's the history of humankind, of culture, of media technologies, for sure.
Thank you very much, Evelyn. We already discussed on Film Explorer about artificial intelligence, technology, and film. We will continue to do this. The occasion at Locarno Film Festival with what you, with Kevin Billy, and the rest of the team organized. It was a great opportunity to dive into these questions. So thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, please stay tuned to what we do at Uzi. We're embarking on a number of interesting AI-related cinema projects.
Yeah, to be followed. Thank you.
Thanks so much.